Today we have Douglas Dietrich. Now, he is unprecedented in many things, and not the least of which, this is, I think, our 6th or 7th interview, usually about 3 hours. I've never had anybody back nearly that many times, and no way that long. And why? Because he has a million things to say that are very important and very different to what a lot of people are used to hearing. Most notably, around the World War II aspects and the tangential issues of aliens and drug wars and so forth that come from his work as a DOD librarian. His job was to destroy top-secret documents, which he took notes from, good for us, bad for them, to expose what was really going on, while the Public Relations Department, better known as the mainstream media, has been putting out a whole different information, a whole different scenario. And so he took notes, even some pictures, drawings, etc., as you have heard on other shows he has been on here, and has been presenting this information to make people aware of what really happened. During the time frame that he was there, he saw these various items, so his knowledge will be limited to what he saw and who he talked to during those times, but believe me, the limit seems endless. And tonight we'll be talking about the secret space program of the U.S. of A. Now, you're listening, you might think you're going to start hearing about Jump Room to Mars and how they've gone through, perhaps even gone back in time and so forth. But what I can predict, I'm coming into this like you. I'm coming in with no real prior knowledge, a little bit. We talked a little bit on the phone. But I can tell from the other information Douglas has brought out that we're probably going to be in for yet another cold slap in the face of the ineptness, cold-heartedness, and the, I don't know how else to say it, just evilness of the people running this country. And, of course, it's really all countries have their own versions of it. But what makes this, I think, more important is that we've been given this America, the government, we're the good guys, we go in and do all this stuff, we won the war, we help people, etc. In reality, unfortunately, there's a lot of dark scum that have been calling the shots for quite a long time, not only putting the wool over our eyes, but, putting death and destruction to both its citizens and the citizens of the world. So it is a dark show, but, we have to know what things are in order to change them and prevent them from continuing or being repeating. You will repeat history if you don't know what really happened. And when you have a media and an academia who is complicit, either in ignorance or in laziness or in outright coercion with the powers that be to present the reality that we think we know. And so I appreciate Doug taking the time to talk with us and doing this pre-record. It's rather early for him out in the West Coast. And DouglasDietrich.com is the webpage. You can also find him on Facebook. Douglas D. Dietrich, I believe, is the page. And there's a Douglas Dietrich. We'll get that information from him. And welcome back, Douglas.
Yes, thanks so much for having me here, and I hope everyone can find some grim amusement in blood and oxygen not normally reaching my brain until 6 p.m. at night. Some days it doesn't reach my brain at all, but we're going to work with it, and even though my brain is pickled at the moment, we'll see what that pickled brain can come up with.
Now, what is the official Facebook stuff? I know you do a lot of work on there with information. People, that's probably their best bet for update information. And then your website, of course, has your DVDs and other things. So what is your official Facebook page?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. The official Facebook page where people can reach my public timeline is facebook.com/Douglas Duane Dietrich. Douglas is spelled with one S. Duane is spelled D-U-A-N-E, and Dietrich is spelled just like the old actress Marlene Dietrich. As we move into a new century and a lot of people forget who Marlene Dietrich is, just take the words diet and rich and put them together. D-I-E-T for diet, R-I-C-H for rich. So Douglas Duane Diet Rich, all lowercase, all one word. Facebook.com/Douglas Duane Diet Rich. And you'll be able to keep up on plenty of new things, including UFOCon. I do need to emphasize that. Check out the banner either on my website, like Mr. Jancik was kind enough to mention, www.douglasdietrich.com, again, douglasdietrich.com, or you can go straight to www.ufocon2012.com. Once again, that's ufocon2012.com. So ufocon2012.com, and you'll get all the information you need. And there will be speakers at that particular weekend, which is coming right upon us. It'll be this month, September 14th, a Friday night. Come on into the Santa Clara Marriott in the greater San Francisco Bay Area, and you'll be meeting all of the speakers, including myself. You can banquet with us. Check the details on the website for that. Saturday the 15th through Sunday the 16th, we'll all be speaking, and that will include people who speak about things like Jump Room to Mars, Mr. Andrew Basiaggio. For people who find interest in that, there seems to be a general interest in such things. Laura Eisenhower will be there, the great-granddaughter of General Eisenhower, who, of course, became the 34th President of the United States. Now, General Eisenhower, like President Truman, was contending with the talk-down processes concerning the Japanese, who were all legally defined both by the United States military, and Japanese citizens in the United States were illegally redefined as enemy aliens. Okay, so this was a term that was utilized up until 1952, when the Treaty of San Francisco went into effect. Again, to reemphasize this, Treaty of San Francisco was signed at the United Nations building, where the United Nations was established, on site the Presidio military base, where I worked for almost a decade, responsible for documents destruction, including many internationally unsecreted documents, because there was no top secret security clearance level system that had been established in place for international documentation. That meant that there was no real categorization at the time for things like the World Affairs Council, for institutions that were supranational, such as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. When the United Nations was established, it was almost unprecedented. We had the League of Nations before it, but the League of Nations was not an organization of war. The United Nations was established as an organization of war per Title 42 of the United Nations Charter. In lieu of a constitution, they have a charter. It was meant particularly to orchestrate resistance armies behind Axis-occupied enemy lines the world over. Resistance armies in the Philippines, behind Japanese enemy lines. Resistance armies in Denmark, behind Nazi enemy lines. All of them were orchestrated from the Pentagon of the United Nations, established before the United Nations peace building in New York City on January 1st of 1942. Now, on September 8th of 1951, Treaty of San Francisco was signed, legally ending the Japanese-American War, and it did not go into effect until April 27th of 1952. So until that date and time, Japan and America were legally at war and under ceasefire. And but the war still continued very actively on the Chinese mainland. Now, to put this into perspective, before I give it back to Mr. Jancik for a second, because this is so important for Americans to understand, Americans can comprehend the fact that Americans were occupying Korea and exploiting Korean prostitutes while fighting Koreans in the field. They can understand that Americans were occupying Vietnam and exploiting Vietnamese prostitutes while fighting Vietnamese in the field. For some reason, due to intensive indoctrination and propaganda that has destroyed the culture of America, that's destroyed America's very matrix of reality, Americans can't seem to comprehend the fact that Americans were occupying Japan and exploiting American prostitutes, all the while they were fighting Japanese in the field. Okay, I don't see the disconnect. But then again, I was born in Asia. I was born in China. I was born in the Nationalist Republic of China as reestablished on the island of Taiwan, which until 1950, towards the cessation of the ceasefire and the beginning of the peace processes, when that peace treaty of San Francisco went into effect, till that point in time, was a Japanese island that had never been invaded. It was a huge Japanese island, much larger than Okinawa. As a matter of fact, there was a choice of invasions of Iwo Jima, which is different from Okinawa, different island chain system, much smaller than Okinawa. Iwo Jima was a Marine Corps-styled invasion, and that even chewed up the vast majority of combat-effective Marine Corps units at the time. Okinawa essentially decimated them. From that point forward, after Okinawa, most Marine Corps units deployed would be totally green units, if they were to be deployed in the field at all. Okinawa essentially destroyed the United States Marine Corps as an effective, cohesive, larger task force. So the point that I'm making is, had they decided to invade Taiwan, that would have been a D-Day style invasion. It would have taken the army, would have taken much larger units. And that was one of the reasons why they didn't invade Taiwan. So Taiwan is large as one of the southern islands of Japan itself. And nobody in America remembers it. Everybody thinks, oh, somehow they suddenly comprehend that at some point it became Chinese without ever considering, how did this happen? That's part of the reality disconnect that I'm talking about. Well, what happened was the Chinese Civil War, with heavy Japanese, American, and Soviet involvement, was continuing from 1945 through 1950. That was continuity of the Second World War on the Asiatic mainland. So that has part to do with what we're talking about: covert wars, covert space programs, and so much of your hidden history that Americans are kept totally unaware of. So with your permission, Mr. Jancik, what I'd like to start on is a good example of that secret kind of technology program, space program, that essentially has to do with the Battle of Los Angeles, the aerodynamics of atmospheric craft that the Japanese were deploying, and how that, in a sense, translates into later on the spatial environment that we'll be getting into with the secret space programs that the Nazis originated and then ultimately translated into the American conflicts with the Soviets in space, what people don't know about the space around them.
All right, and actually, before we get, a couple of things popped up in your soliloquy. There was, I never thought about the Taiwan thing, and when you brought it up, it's like, well, how did we go from Japan owning or controlling or whatever, claiming Taiwan, and China and Japan being not friends, and Japan, United States, and so forth, siding with the government in China in rebellion. How did it move from a Japanese island to a Chinese island in a peaceful manner, or was it peaceful?
It was peaceful, and the reason for that was because the Sino-Japanese situation was extremely complicated. One of the first things that Americans have to realize is that their history has been so warped by a black and white style of propaganda, the either-or propaganda. You're either with us or against us. The George Bush W. Jr. kind of speech where he gets in front of the world and says, I just want to kill everybody, with that post 9/11 speech where he was just declaring war on everybody who he could think of. North Korea, Iran, Iraq. There weren't enough enemies for that dude. I mean, it was the new axis of evil. Of course, once his Saudi masters got a hold of him, it all got switched back to the idea of we're going to limit our field of operations and who we're attacking, etc. No more infinite justice. He had to change the code name for all that. Okay, those are the shades of gray that come in after the original black and white propaganda pablum that gets spewed from the lips of politicians. So too with history. Taiwan was outright owned by the Japanese. In 1898, the Japanese fought the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War. The Chinese put up as best a fight as they could with the Manchurian dynasty actually floating a semi-modern fleet of steam-driven ships that were ultimately wiped out by the Japanese. And basically, at that point in time, the 1895, the Chinese surrendered the sovereignty of the island of Taiwan to the Japanese. At the same time, the island of Taiwan had never been really culturally part of China. It actually considered itself an independent nation. There were several levels of complexity. This is very similar to Napoleon being Bonaparte was actually raised Italian. And his mother was Corsican. She was a freedom fighter for Corsican independence. The Austro-Hungarian government sold the island of Corsica to to France. And at that period of time, she was still fighting for Corsican independence. So you see the complexity here. It's very similar to that. There were people on Taiwan then and now who simply want an independent Taiwan. But the reality is that, like Corsica, it went between two great powers. And when it was ultimately incorporated into the Japanese Imperium, it had a very positive experience, very similar to Austria's experience with the Third Reich, where you find most unregenerate Nazis is not in Germany, it is in Austria. And the same with Taiwan. Taiwan's experience with Japanese imperialism was quite positive. So the Taiwanese have a very Japanized, Japanophiliac culture in which they are ethnically Chinese, very acculturated in Japanois, and that's the complexity of that situation. As for the politics, the Americans under the Roosevelt Socialist administration had betrayed the Nationalist Republic of China. And at that point in time, there were four major layers of Chinese society. There was the traditional Manchurian dynasty, which still was extant, only geographically had retreated to the north in what is known as Manchuria. And those are not ethnic Chinese. Manchurians are Manchurians, just like Okinawans are Okinawans. Okinawans speak Japanese, but they are ethnically and culturally not Japanese, just as Irish speak English, but are in no way, shape, or form.
You know, I mean, hearing this stuff, it makes total sense, but I don't know if this betrays an unintentional but latent bias or prejudices, is that you just kind of group them all together. I mean, there's Japanese and there's Chinese. I mean, I'm being honest, but I'm not being nasty. I mean, I just never thought about all the little nuances of it, you know?
Well, I mean, who could afford the time to do so when the average American is basically trying to feed themselves, basically trying to feed their families, and the average American works harder than any other person on earth. They put in more time, they put in more hours. The average American works themselves to death. And the average American works more than the average Japanese or German, who are world-renowned for the work that they put out. But the Japanese and the Germans and every other developed nation on earth has a social network that functions. America is a third-world nation. It is like the former Soviet Union. And its totalitarian ideology, a 20th century aberration in human development, very similar to that of Soviet Union's, collectivized communism, which they enforced through force majeure, through force of arms, through invasions. Most communist regimes were set up through invasions as opposed to revolutions. The same with the Americans. Their totalitarian ideology is called democracy. It's an alien ideology to China, to Japan, to every other nation on earth. But the Americans have imposed it on other nations through force majeure, through force of arms, through invasion. Not through instigating revolutions in other nations, but actual invasions. They invaded Iraq to establish a democracy. And so the point is, in this democracy, which is a totalitarian state, you are given no information whatsoever except what they want you to find, except what they want you to have. And in terms of culture, because most Americans were European descent in the majority for such a long period of time, they knew about the nuances of European culture inescapably. Their totalitarian democracy couldn't hide that. But when it came to Asiatic culture, it's just like the TV series King of the Hill, where the main character is talking to a Laotian immigrant in Texas. And, of course, they're saying, "So, you Chinese or you Japanese?" And he says, "Well, I'm Laotian. I'm from a landlocked nation in Southeast Asia." They say, "So that part of China or Japan?" I mean, that's just the brain lock. Just goes back to that. So we're speaking of something similar. Well, the Manchurian dynasty had existed for almost half a millennium, a good 200 to 300 years, longer than the American Republic has lasted. And the Manchu dynasty of the Qing was still extant, had retreated to the north, and there were three major, Chinese republics in the rest of core China. Those were the Nationalist Chinese Republic, as established by Sun Yat-sen. They were the Imperial Republic, established by Yuan Shikai, and they were the Communist Republic, established by the Mao Zedong and the Chinese revolutionary cadres. Now, the largest republic, which the Americans have never heard of, is that, and the oldest republic, again, which the Americans have never heard of, was that established by Yuan Shikai, which was, he declared himself a Han Chinese emperor. That's ethnic Chinese, by the way. So that was the majority. The majority of people in China are Han, ethnic Chinese. So he was the first Han emperor within half a thousand years, after the Mongols, after the Manchus. He sided with Japan. Now, when the Japanese declared war formally against the United States, December 7th, 1941, Yuan Shikai declared war on the United States. That means the largest and oldest republic in China, allied with Japan, declared war on the United States. Okay, no one in America knows about this. Emperor Bao Dai of Vietnam declared war on the United States. Emperor Puyi of Manchuria declared war on the United States. The Emperor of Thailand declared war on the United States. All of the emperors in Asia declared war on the United States. There is no one I have met in the United States, including the vast majority of history professors, who know this. Now, this is beyond me, but this is part of the ignorance that is enforced on the American public by their totalitarian democracy. So, now, with the complexities involving the nationalist Chinese, in the movie The Sand Pebbles, which was written by a veteran of the gunboat patrols in China, which my father was a part of. Now, the author of that book, his name was Krenna. I believe it was either Crenna or it began with a K, Krenna. Now, this individual, like my father, served unhappily in the gunboat patrols and fought against the Japanese from 1937 until formal declaration of war in 1941. Now, that whole complex story was portrayed as completely as he could, as a matter of fact, as fragmentedly as he could, because he was portraying it in a dramatic fashion, so he couldn't give you a history lesson. No one seems to notice that, or rather they do and then they forget, that in that film, American sailors are portrayed historically very accurately, because it's portrayed by a veteran of that theater of conflict, the China Command, fighting tooth and nail with nationalist Chinese. Not communist Chinese, nationalist Chinese. So the nationalist Chinese were at war with the Americans just as much as the Japanese. Now, why doesn't anyone remember this? Why doesn't anyone remember that the Americans sided not with the nationalist Chinese, but with the communist Chinese? Now, Roosevelt was an ardent communist. He supported Stalin, and his man in China initially was Evans Fortis Carlson, United States Marine Corps General. Evans Fortis Carlson was a card-carrying member, English is a second language for me, of the Communist Party. In any other administration, he would have been court-martialed for treason. In the Roosevelt administration, he was promoted to the level of general. He turned in papers advising that the United States do away with the ranking system in the military and adapt the communist Chinese style of military meritocracy, where instead of officers and soldiers, you had fighters and leaders, and people advanced on the basis of combat experience. Regardless of the merits of this suggestion, Evans Fortis Carlson was a communist, and he's a general. Now keep this in mind. It's not a Rambo movie. When you have a general in theater, it's not just a guy running around with a firearm. It is a man with an entire field headquarters. He's got accountants. He's got administrators. He's got quartermasters. He's got an entire logistics train behind him. We're talking about thousands and thousands of men to keep a general functioning in the field. That's why they call it a general headquarters, a general office. He's got a headquarters in the field. This Marine Corps general started the war under Roosevelt's orders when the Japanese and the Chinese were holding peace talks in Nanjing. Now, the Nanking Massacre, the Americans pronounce Nanjing as Nanking. The Nanking Massacre is probably the most infamous Japanese atrocity of the Second World War, written about by Iris Chang, who died mysteriously, supposedly a suicide. She was Chinese. She died because she wrote a book called The Trail of the Silkworm, in which she described a Chinese-American scientist who was born in the United States, spoke perfect English, and he wound up defecting to China because throughout his life, they kept hounding him as a potential Chinese spy. He finally got so ticked off, he moved to China and developed the Silkworm missile system, one of the finest missiles in the world for the communist Chinese, because he couldn't stand the persecution he was receiving in America in the 1980s. Now, Iris Chang died very shortly after that. Now, all people remember is not The Trail of the Silkworm, but her book, The Rape of Nanking. Now, how did that start? That started because Evans Fortis Carlson and his Marine Corps raiders attacked the Japanese and Chinese while they were holding a peace summit under truce of peace in the capital, wartime capital of China, Nanjing. The Japanese took it as a betrayal by the Chinese and launched into the Nanjing Massacre until it was finally discovered that basically white men, Caucasians, were spotted in ink black and Chinese coolie uniforms, and that's when they bombed the HMS Ladybird. Since they couldn't tell whites apart, all Caucasians look alike to Asians. They bombed both the British HMS Ladybird and the U.S. USS Panay.
I don't feel so bad, no.
There you go. That's right. That's right.
Well, I mean, this is like it seems like when I ask a question, it's like there's so many components here. It's hard to consolidate it into an answer. I mean, it's like, oh, you want to know why they went there? Well, you're going to have a 4-hour history lesson on, but.
Yeah, that's inescapable. Yeah, it's inescapable because unfortunately that's reality as opposed to what Americans are given, which is patriotic pablum and just pure simplistic crap. I'm sorry, you know what I mean, though. Of all people, you understand the pain of this. This is why when I start talking about Roswell, for instance, not that we want to go into that right now, but just a situation like that, and people tune out because unfortunately this is reality. I can't say what is it that the government gives you that has lasted for so many years.
Yeah, I mean, it's important because you see, once you walk down, I guess if people were looking like this, if you're walking on a map and you're hitting forks in the road and you keep on going, all right, and at one point you're going, look, I took the wrong turn. You have to back up to the next fork. Oh, that's the wrong turn. To the next fork, to back up. And the next thing you know, you're almost at the beginning of the trail and you have to go the other way. Well, you won't know until you reinvestigate each fork in the road, and that's what you're doing here is you went back to the beginning and are taking us down each of the corrected forks, and it just takes time and words. So, I mean, there's really no other way you can do it other than come up with some kind of a new version of a pat answer, and we want to know the actual real deal here.
Well, this is the historical equivalent of your own spiritual journey, Mr. Jancik, because what happened with you was you grew up in an environment where you had a very simplistic theology, and you ultimately became a sovereign Christian. I think would be probably the best applicable term for it because you investigated theology on your own. And I had to keep backing up,
and I had to keep backing up backing up. Each time I got to a fork, I had to go back another one. And so, I mean, I understand how this, we're going here. We're coming in on the, we'll call it the right paths, and it takes time to explain why each path is right rather than what we've been told.
Right, and we don't want to start a theological argument between Mr. Jancik and the listening audience, but a good example of this would be most mature and studied theologians take great umbrage and basically just get to the point where they're pulling their hair out with the level of frustration that they feel when they're confronted with simplistic theological doctrine. Excellent example, unfortunately, would be the rapture, and that provides everyone, in the most literal sense, an easy way out. And theologians are confronted with the scriptural non-existence for this stance, and they do their best to explain it. And ultimately, many people reject it simply because they don't want the complexity. They want the simplistic escape. And that, unfortunately, is the secret of escapist cultists. And it leads to mass suicides. It leads to aberrant behavior. It leads to unfortunate decisions like mistreating the environment around you, the people around you, not caring for them because you yourself have an escape route. It leads to your economy going down the tubes because no one is concentrating on tomorrow. Everybody's concentrating on the escape route. Well, that's what Americans have been presented historically, and that's why the society is in decline. Simplistic history led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Simplistic history is leading to the collapse of the United States. So in terms of reality, to get back into the reality, the Second World War effectively started between the Japanese and Americans December 13th, 1937, when the HMS Lady Bird and the USS Pan A were bombed. My father was in theater. He was fighting the Japanese for the next half decade. And that was essentially before Pearl Harbor. And what was going on during that time was the Japanese had established enormous technological research centers that ultimately would put them on top of the field in the war, on top of the game, and that brings us to the Battle of Los Angeles. I mean, people today, for instance, have this incredibly disjointed perspective on the Japanese technology of the time, and they think it was somehow, shall we say, backwards. They feel that somehow nothing was going on in terms of some kind of technological edge on the part of the Japanese until American occupation, and suddenly they were all taught how to make these fabulous machines, and now they're technologically somehow way ahead of the Americans. It's just madness. And the reality is the Japanese were far ahead of the Americans in the Second World War, and it led to victory. People talk about Area 51. People talk about the Germans, and we'll get to that, with Antarctica and their own version of Area 51. Nobody speaks of Japan's Area 51. Well, that was Minami Mori Torishima, Southern Bird Island, 1.2 kilometers in area and 989 miles from Tokyo. And it's the southernmost and easternmost island of Japan in the Japanese chain of archipelagos even today. Quite literally, the hottest place in Japan. And it's a coral reef that was fossilized into a landmass, and basically the Japanese channeled out a canal for submarines to enter that island so it could forever be resupplied without any ships on the surface being sighted or sunk. And it was the home of the Japanese 16th Tank Regiment, comprised during World War II of Type 95 Haigos. Now, this is extremely important because the Americans basically said, this is Monster Island. That is where the term Monster Island was first applied to a Japanese island that was later on popularized in Toho movies about kaiju, or giant monsters. The term was originally coined by the United States. Now, Minami Mori was attacked by U.S. aircraft as a primary Tokyo target since it was within 1,200 miles of Tokyo proper during the Doolittle raid of 1942. And on March 4th, Minami Mori was attacked by the USS Enterprise in the Marcus Island raid. Now, there were no less than 4 United States submarine-launched special reconnaissance missions conducted by UDT, Underwater Demolitions Team Frogmen. These were the predecessors to the U.S. Navy SEALs. And they confirmed advanced Japanese weapons programs. These were deemed war breakers in terms of expected impact on the United States war effort. And the first two such scuba recce raids exposing such were in June of 1943 and August of 1943. One was by the USS Sea Raven. The other was launched from the USS Sunfish. Now, on August 31st of 1943, Rear Admiral Charles Pownall, aboard the Yorktown, commanded Task Force 15. This was the largest aircraft carrier task force ever deployed on a single mission in the Pacific throughout the Second World War. It struck 900 miles deep into the Japanese Empire, past Japanese-held islands, such as Wake, into Tokyo's outermost jurisdiction. By the way, Monster Island, Minami Mori Torishima, is under Tokyo jurisdiction. So it's part of Tokyo. That means that Tokyo, in terms of its area and geography, is the largest city on Earth. It would be so even without Minami Mori Torishima. But Minami Torishima included into Tokyo makes Tokyo immense. So the point is, they're striking Tokyo itself, technically. And they were going to obliterate the Monster Island armored garrison so that they could invade and take out all of the laboratories developing weapons in Monster Island, all of its advanced technology weapons development capacities. This was a huge armada. It consisted of the USS Yorktown, the USS Enterprise, the USS Essex. These are carriers. The battleship USS Indiana, 2 cruisers, at least 4 flotillas of destroyers. Think about what I'm saying. And even fleet oilers to enable a maintenance of a siege. And they failed. Now, on March 23rd of 1944, another impressive U.S. Navy task force, aircraft carriers, was deployed in a follow-up operation. It conducted a 48-hour, round-the-clock, 2-day attack on Monster Island with literally hundreds of planes. Think about what I'm saying. And they failed. Now, on September 7th of 1944, the first time in the Greater Pacific War, U.S. land-based liberators hit Monster Island. After that, there were 2 further submarine-launched scuba insertions of American Commando frogmen, and they revealed that weapons development continued apace with no impediments. Note it in operational capabilities of the Imperial Japanese 16 Armored Regiment's abilities to repel invasions. And this was in May 1945, the first mission of this sort from the USS Pito, and the USS Piranha launched another one in June of 1945. Think about what I'm saying, 1945. Now, Monster Island was never successfully garrison compromised enough to mount an American invasion throughout the Second World War, and it is still Japanese occupied as a district of the megalopolis of Greater Tokyo. Now, you know nothing about this. And the end result is that weapons were developed there that helped the Japanese win the war. Now, we've got other islands that are even stranger in terms of what goes on. One of them was Nakanori Torishima. Now, excuse me, that would be another island. Nakano Torishima. And Nakano Torishima is also known as Ganges Island. Ganges. You're going to find nothing about this of any consequence on the net. You're going to have to look high and low in antique shops, and you will find Ganges Island on the globe, Nakano Torishima. You will find it on maps that were printed throughout the Second World War. You'll find it on maps because it was discovered by the Germans. When the Germans discovered it, they used to have an enormous amount of the Pacific. The Germans had what was known as German Polynesia. And after World War I, the Japanese took over administration of what was much of former German Polynesia. So the Germans discovered Ganges Island. That's how it got its name. When the Japanese occupied it, it was known as Nakano Torishima. I guarantee you, you will never find it on any map, ever. It's not on any map that is satellite made, no GPS system. You won't find it on Google search, Google Maps. You won't find it anywhere. It's not going to be acknowledged as extant. It doesn't exist officially. So that is a story in and of to itself. So that is the kind of crap that we're dealing with. You live in a reality that is created for you. You live in a reality in the so-called democracy. Now, what's part of that reality? The Battle of Los Angeles, the Japanese raid.
I want to get to that second. So, I mean, see, this is what people who are listening and said, hey, I tuned in here. I want to hear about the cool space stuff. This is going to be the deal when you get into the questions. It is a very deep journey. This is why all the shows that Douglas does should be downloaded and listened to if you really want to know what it is. Now, a lot of people just want to hear some cool stuff, and I'm not opposed to that. I like to hear some stuff, and oh wow. But if you really want to know the answers to reality, as you alluded to with your example of Christianity, if you really want to know truth, it's going to be some digging work. And what Douglas has put for us is a trail here that one could go down and find this information and look at it and research more on it. But you're not going to get it spoon-fed you in the propaganda-driven press. People made fun of Russia for Pravda, etc. Oh, that's all just propaganda. It's like, well, it's funny how Pravda today might even have more truth in it than our current media. So this is something you're going to have to, you, the listener, I, the listener, have to get over any type of arrogance. Oh, well, we're the good guys. We are not the United States of America. It is a group of people who are power hungry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have to detach as a human being from the government or nationality you're in, or even the ethnicity, because any coloring of it, well, my people wouldn't do this, or this group always does that. You have to get out of that. And when we get out of that and get clean from it and go in with a clean slate, you can see that the lesson here is that the people who are mining the store are controlling you, not unlike the movie Matrix puts out, not necessarily in that graphic, legitimate, action, but in a reality that is metaphorically the same thing.
Well, I mean, a good example would be a comparison again with the Soviet Union. That's an excellent analogy, because there were Russians 1,000 years before there was a constitutional entity known as the Republic of the Soviet Union. And there are still Russians who have survived the collapse of that republic. There were Americans of the European genetic genotype. Obviously, there were indigenous Americans here for well over 1,000 years before they showed up. But for Americans who consider themselves European Americans or Americans of European heritage, they were here along with the Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock, and they were here for hundreds of years before there was a constitutional entity known as the United States. And there were people who considered themselves royal Americans, subjects under the crown. There were people who considered themselves part of a theocracy. And all of these many Americans had lasted on this North American continent longer than the period of time that the constitutional republic later imposed on them, known as the United States, has been around. And when that republic collapses, there will still be such Americans. So, yes, it's not just remember that as an American, it's something that's far different and deeper than being a U.S. citizen. Your U.S. citizenship ceased to matter when Roosevelt took away all meaning when he interred 124,000 U.S. citizens of Japanese ethnicity and many U.S. citizens of Italian and German ethnicity who also suffered internment. There were many Germans and Italians in internment camps. Now, the Japanese, of course, were the most numerous and suffered the most. Unfortunately, martial law was never declared, so all of the civil statutes and civil rights were still in effect for all of these people, and the American public said, go for it. The end result was that when the Supreme Court, decades later, went back and said, oh, it's all cool, it's all legal, in one of the most disastrous decisions of that tribunal and one of the most illegal, then what they said at that point in time, just as they did when the internment first took place, was that your U.S. citizenship doesn't mean anything. Your U.S. citizenship is meaningless. All it means is they want your taxes. Because other than that, anytime they want, for whatever reason, they can take all of your financial property. They can take all of your real estate property. They can take you.
That is absolutely true.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the problem that we're going to run into. And I tell you, we'll probably take a break in a little bit, and we'll come back and get into the space stuff. But
yeah,
and I want to start with the Battle of Los Angeles as a segue into it, because we have some questions that came up from a previous interview on that. But, I mean, this is the deal. I mean, when we're listening to hear what the work Douglas has done, this is a serious, like scholarly. It's a serious thing. It's not a. I'm going to kick back and relax and listen to some fiction that sounds cool. I mean, it takes work. It takes a very interesting, you got to be committed to truth. And this is why I think the people who want to find truth are going to be glued to you and want more, and other people who don't like the reality you're spinning are going to repel from you and come up with petty, basically name calling because they don't have evidence to refute it. Which I'm sure you would agree, those are pretty much the two camps that you found.
Yes, yeah, very much so, and it's similar to theological arguments because people are vested in this emotionally. That's why the theological comparison is so apt, and that's actually why Mr. Jancik and I have such a good chemistry. It's because Mr. Jancik's own spiritual journey has led him to similar reactions. Basically, rather than people coming back with solid arguments, I feel you've probably experienced what I have. A kind of, in the end, a verbal assault is basically what people are left with.
I mean, in essence, they're going to have a name. They're going to give you a name, whether that name is disinfo agent, whether that name is some Asian ethnicity slam, whether it is traitor to your country. It's all names. They're not, wait a minute, he's got an error here because look at this document on this point. You're not going to hear that because most people won't even put the effort in to even try to find something. But, that's the deal here.
Well, and before we go into break, something that I do need to get out of the way, when you do find explanations, if you're wiki trolling, and again, I cannot overemphasize this, the Wikipedia is organic, and it's fascinating in that sense because it organically develops. But it organically develops from a foundation of manure, which instead of producing plants, really produces weeds. Remember that originally, before there was an internet, there was DARPANet, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency Net, and that segued into military electronics information dissemination networks like DeltaNet, which primarily carried child pornography. And that was a U.S. Army infonet.
Actually, when I started out in the internet work at the 89 or whatever like that, when they did have the references, the number one use of the internet at that time was pornography. It was number one use.
Well, it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed. But believe me, as far as I'm concerned, that's all it's good for. But in many respects, I mean, I hate to, I don't mean that literally, but I say that facetiously. But at the same time, when DARPANet released the internet on the American public, the weakest link in the chain is human data entry. They entered information into the internet that they wanted you to see. And the entire objective, as officially stated, was CRE, consensus reality enforcement. That was the term that was used, consensus reality enforcement. So their entire desire with the internet was to indoctrinate you, not to inform you. And it's been that way ever since. Now, there's plenty of documentation I destroyed and incinerated that never made it into DARPANet. This is why you have military men ultimately making decisions that are entirely at ends with reality. General Petraeus. Now, that man was a name that I heard back in the days of Colonel Aquino when I served with him. Now, this does not mean that the man is affiliated with the Temple of Set or the Satanic Church. Nevertheless, he apparently was groomed by many parties, including the officially recognized Satanic Chaplain of the U.S. Army, Colonel Michael Aquino, for his ultimate position, which was to take over the CIA. The Army and the CIA had an enormous interdepartmental infighting conflict, and ultimately the Army won, and General Petraeus took over the CIA. Now, this individual is infamous for basically stating that we won the Vietnam War. And whatever professional performance can be attributed to the United States Army, the fact remains that no less than 50 accountable battles can be counted as clear losses within the Vietnam War. So the entire claim that Petraeus made was that we didn't lose a single battle in the Vietnam War. Now, you've got a man who's saying something that's patently absurd. this is on the equivalent of Stephen Ambrose, who's the author of Citizen Soldiers, and he says America never lost a single battle in World War II after Pearl Harbor. Now, that is so insane a statement. That is so insane a statement. The attack by the German Luftwaffe on the Italian port city of Bari destroyed more ships, without taking into account the chemical weapons that blew up, which is a totally different story we don't want to get into at the moment, destroyed more ships than were destroyed at Pearl Harbor for both the British and the Americans combined. So that, that's not taken into account. The Battle of the Sulu Straits, what's known as the Battle of the Java Sea, that was the largest naval defeat of the United States in history. And it never makes it into the history books. And
yeah, I know. When I went up to Canada, a lady purposely took me. I forgot what city I was in. I think it was in London, Canada. Yeah. She took me to a statue, and she said, you're never going to either hear about this man or know this guy in your school. And now, of course, now the name escapes me, but I'm bad with names, remembering names. He told me about a general. He goes, you ever hear of this guy? I'm, no, I don't think so. And he's the one that burned down Washington, D.C.
Yes.
And they tacked on it. He's the only, foreign, whatever, to be able to hit the capital of the United States or whatever. It's like that. And this was back in the late 1990s. I was up there. Yeah. And I just said, I think my comment was well, I guess we won in the long term, didn't we? Or some kind of a thing. Because I was half offended. Like, why would she go out of her way to, jam me with this? And on the other hand, it's like Canada's always got this little brother to America jealousy, and I just, and at this point in time, that's pales compared to what you're bringing forward here.
Well, by the way, just to put what she did in perspective, that general was the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was the British invaded, and they burned down the White House, which, by the way, used to be pink. It used to be the Pink House. So, I'm not lying.
No, I know. Remember what his name is?
I have no idea. I don't.
Anyway,
I don't.
Yeah, that's their...
Yeah. By the way, the Canadians also militarily defeated the United States when the United States attempted to invade them during that period of time. So, that's something that Americans never read about in their history books either. But in terms of, by the way, that was the Battle of the Savo Sea, Savo Sound. It was SAVO. So people just look up Savo, SAVO. The Americans will propagandize it, they'll twist it, they'll warp it, and they'll woof it. The end result is that was a major battle in the Pacific, which the Americans lost. And lost quite soundly. Never makes it into your all you hear about is Midway, and technically the Americans lost that as well. That's a whole nother thing to go into, and that goes into part of the whole Japanese humoring the Americans thing that we've gone into before. One of the things Mr. Jancik asked was, how is it that the Japanese, well, if they won the war, why don't they just rub it down Americans' throats? Why don't they have a cultural, complex about this? And the Asian attitude is very similar to like what I told Mr. Jancik about basically they tend to be extremely polite and act the way they think people want them to act. I mean, they did an experiment in psychology and sociology studies where they had an American just laughing at atrocities on a movie screen. And they brought in a Japanese man to sit down with him, and the Japanese man didn't know the American, and so the Japanese man just laughed along with him until the American left the room, at which point the Japanese person exhibited just obvious disgust. He was being recorded unbeknownst to him. He did not know he was being recorded.
I'm looking. I mean, introduced. Do you want to finish that line, and we'll get.
And just want to say that very similar to that would be like the Battle of Midway and the invasion of Alaska. The Battle of Midway is presented to the Americans as an American Trafalgar because Japanese carriers, 4 of them were sunk. Well, a carrier is nothing without its pilots, who constitute its ability to project air power. Now, the Americans lost an equal number of pilots to the Japanese, pretty much, about 150 pilots, whereas the Japanese lost about 200. So the Americans lost just as many pilots, even though they lost only 1 carrier. Beyond that, the Battle of Midway was a tremendous success because the Japanese intent was the invasion and holding of Alaska, which the Americans were going to use as the closest islands to Japan to bomb Japan. Because the Japanese invaded Alaska and held the Aleutians Islands, the Americans couldn't bomb Japan until they developed super stratospheric bombers, the B-29s, to bomb Japan with. And even they were to run into their problems. But the point that I'm making is, because of Midway, the Japanese occupied Alaska, prevented the bombing of the home islands. Midway was a tremendous Japanese victory. And Americans don't understand this. Now, when a Japanese military professor was asked to write an article for the Americans, he wrote about, oh, God, this battle was a tremendous waste of time, this invasion of Alaska, what an incredible waste of manpower and resources. He just wrote what the Americans wanted to hear. And in Japanese, for instance, the captain of the I-58, which sank the USS Indianapolis, which delivered the atomic bomb to Tinian Island, then was sunk by the Japanese submarine. And the Americans actually asked that Japanese submarine commander, can you come in to this trial so we can court-martial this American? He said, well, why? He said, I launched 3 suicide torpedoes. There's no way he could have avoided them. They were manned. They were intelligent torpedoes. They had men inside them who guided them to the ship. He couldn't have avoided them. And they said, well, we don't want you to say that. We want you to say they were regular torpedoes so that we can say he was incompetent and court-martial him. And because they were using him as a scapegoat, because after it delivered the atomic bomb, it was sunk, and it suffered the worst, largest shark-feeding frenzy in recorded history. And so the Japanese submarine commander came to the United States, and in an unprecedented legal display, an enemy commander testified against an American commander because the Americans had asked him if he would do so. He actually didn't. He actually defended the American commander in court. He refused to do what the Americans asked, but they didn't care anyway. And by the way, and the manned torpedoes, he did acquiesce to that. He didn't mention the manned torpedoes, and because of that.
I want to mention, I looked up while you were talking about the Battle of Savo Island, and this is on Wikipedia, which we just talked about being dubious. But given all of that, it shows that the Allies, quote unquote, had 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers. The Japanese, excuse me, the Empire of Japan had 5 heavy cruisers to the U.S.'s 6, 2 light cruisers to the U.S. light cruisers, 1 destroyer to the U.S. 15 destroyers. Now, the casualties and losses. The U.S. lost 3 heavy cruisers were sunk. The Japan, 3 cruisers moderately damaged. 1 heavy cruiser was damaged, later scuttled. So let's call that a loss too. So 4 heavy cruisers were lost. Japan, 3 cruisers moderately damaged. 2 destroyers were damaged on the U.S. side. No destroyers were damaged on the Japanese side. 1,077 were killed on the U.S. side. 58 were killed on the Japanese side.
Yeah, it was basically the worst defeat in U.S. history. By the way, one of the American captains involved with that action killed himself. And so that's how terrible a defeat.
You know, you're talking about 23 ships versus 9.
Yeah.
And the 9 ships killed 1,000, and they lost 58, and they they destroyed twice. We'll say twice as many ships while not actually losing any ships. They didn't lose any ships.
Yeah. No, that of course never makes it into the history books. Well, and just to finalize this thought about how bizarre things can be and what Americans are willing to accept simply because they have no time to investigate, and probably because also there's an emotional need to believe they will accept the most ridiculous explanations. The Soviet invasion of Korea, for instance, when, as I've explained before, Korea and Japan are practically connected. They may as well be one landmass. You drink a can of beer on the Korean peninsula, you throw it in the water, it'll wash up on a Japanese beach. A healthy, trained athlete can swim the distance. And so when the Soviets came down the Korean peninsula, nothing was going to stop them other than what the Japanese deployed, which was atomic weapons, which created the Korean demilitarized zone, which is so wide that you can see it. What the Japanese essentially used were atomic landmines, and they had built these in northern Korea. The Chosen, the Yalu, the Fusang rivers were all dammed. They created the Konan Industrial Complex, the largest industrial complex in Asia, which was never bombed once by the Americans. The Americans were totally unable to reach it, and the Japanese were surrounded in that area by massive uranium ore deposits. So they built an enormous number of atomic bombs. They didn't need to fly them anywhere. They just used them as atomic landmines, and they stopped the Soviet advance cold. Now, all of the bombs built in Northern Korea, what people always hear is the same old crap. Oh, those are small bombs. They're like they were like World War II era atomic bombs. Well, no kidding. They're built using World War II era Japanese atomic bomb plants and munitions ordnance facilities. So that's why the North Koreans are turning out World War II era Japanese atomic bombs to this day. And so when this is taken into account, everyone might say, well, the Korean demilitarized zone, not only is it so wide that it's the only man-made object that can be seen without telescopic aid from the moon, like the Great Wall of China. If you're an astronaut standing on the surface of the moon without telescopic aid through your faceplate, there's only two man-made objects on Earth you can see. One is the Great Wall of China, the other is the Korean demilitarized zone. And it's so wide that had it not been for that Korean demilitarized zone, where the radiation soon dissipated, you have it as a wildlife sanctuary. Despite all the mines and the barbed wire, the tigers, which would be totally extinct on the Korean peninsula, exist in the demilitarized zone. Korean tigers, as well as sacred cranes, live in the...
Now, are you saying on the actual moon, or are you saying in space around the Earth? Because I'm finding it hard to...
Oh, on the actual moon.
Okay.
The astronauts testified that there's only two man-made objects they could see from, and so in terms of the Korean demilitarized zone, if it weren't for that, there's several species of animals that would be extinct. I mean, this is the kind of crap I get when I'm talking to Americans about the Nazi deployment of the atomic bomb in Courland, Courland, which any American can check the maps of World War II and find out the Courland Peninsula was held after the fall of Berlin. The Germans were still in Courland because they stopped the Soviet advance cold using atomic weapons. And people will say incredible things like, oh, well, you should still be able to find trace radiation. And I'm like thinking, first, with all the radiation that exists all over the Soviet Union, not just from Chernobyl, but from all the nuclear leaky reactors, from all of the ports being polluted with radioactivity from their nuclear submarines, which are floating Chernobyls, etc., that's a ridiculous statement. You can tell the age of different sources, different levels of radiation, sources, etc. But even with that, take a Geiger counter, go to Hiroshima, go to Nagasaki. You're not going to get jack. You're not going to get any readings. World War II era atomic bombs were, comparatively speaking, clean weapons. Basically, just bigger bangs of dynamite from an exotic source of explosive. So that's why it's such a great environmental preserve for a species of animal today. Well, my point is, okay, you got this huge thing. Look in your history books. How did it come about? If you ever are able to find anything, the stupidest explanation, which I found through Wikipedia, was that there's two American officers that were there and they asked the Soviets to stop.
And they said, sure, no problem.
Yes.